home. And so, and also, I guess the third thing is that the kids, while they're still elementary school age, they're big enough that we can kind of, they can leave us alone when we need to be left alone. They can do their own thing and whatnot. So we're very fortunate that way. I can't imagine how hard, single parents with kids, or, especially with little ones, like really little ones, right? Kids who are in daycare and stuff like that. Or I guess the opposite, parents with teenagers, because of course teenagers get all sulky and start, they're even harder to take care of in some ways. So our kids, my wife and I joke that our kids are kind of in the sweet spot.
Nice.
Yeah. So we're very challenge. What? Pardon me?
I said you really know how to plan for a pandemic, right? Your kids are right at the right age to have one.
Well, I'll tell you another way that we're lucky. I'm going on study leave starting officially July 1st. So while my wife and all my other university colleagues have to plan for teaching their classes online starting in the fall, I don't have to worry about that at all. I just have to worry about my own research.
Nice. So your study leave would normally involve travel, would it not?
Well, the sort of stuff that I do, I don't really need to. Partly, with kids, it's a bit of a challenge to travel. Because what do? Do you leave them here, or do you take them with you and whatnot? But I found that actually just staying put, I've got access to my sources. I'm reading books, I'm reading articles. So either the books I have or can get easy access to, or I can look stuff up online. So I don't actually have to transplant myself anywhere. And frankly, it works better for me because I simply get more done.
And that leave extends for a whole year, is that correct?
It's for a whole year, yeah. No, I'm very fortunate. So at the University of Lethbridge, we're eligible for a study leave approximately every 7 years or so. It depends. If you only want a half year, you can go up sooner than 7 years. But I find just for my own kind of the work that I do, I need a full year to kind of do the deep dive.
Got it. Yeah. Well, you have actually, I'm sure you've forgotten more about philosophy and political science than I will ever know. So it's always great to hang around with you and learn from you, because you're right up on top of things and you have such great ideas and a great manner and way to explain them. So it's very enjoyable being with you, sir. So.
Well, thank you. And of course, I wouldn't have that talent if I didn't have friends like you who are such good conversationalists. So thank you.
Hey, now speaking of that,
yeah,
friendship is a theme that is throughout your work, throughout your writing, and throughout the concepts that you review.
Yeah.
Is it friendship specifically to do with politics? Is it more broader based than that?
Well, it's a little bit more broadly based, but the focus, my central core interest is sort of what it has to do with political life. I teach political science in a department of political science. I teach political philosophy, so I look more at the kind of philosophical texts like Plato and Aristotle and others who kind of think kind of more normatively about politics. But also, what I've noticed just in my empirical observations about how not every politician, but I think kind of serious politicians, I think you can kind of see the difference between a serious politician and maybe a huckster, that friendship is actually really important for them. And it's not that hard really to figure out. Friendship plays an important role in many of our, if not all of our different types of relationships. Even sort of business relationships. You're going to want to buy stuff, or you're going to want to have exchanges with people that you trust more, that you value their character a little bit more. So, that's kind of pushing things more into the level of what you might call friendship, as opposed to, say, kind of a sort of crass market exchange or something like that. And I think politics as a kind of activity isn't all that different. And in fact, in politics, people involved in it are dealing with weighty matters that involve you make a choice, you make a decision, and it affects thousands or even millions of people. And I'll just give you kind of one very immediate contemporary example. But through this COVID crisis, apparently, of all people, Premier Doug Ford of Ontario and our Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, have become very good friends with one another. And they've bonded kind of over the work that they have been doing, coordinating the respective provincial and federal responses to the COVID crisis. But as friends often do, or as friendships develop, when the work is done, then they kind of lean on each other. And there's an article I read a few weeks ago that just described, like they interviewed both of them, and it was really quite beautiful, the things that they said about one another. And it's those sort of relationships that are, you might say, forged through the trials of fire that you see quite often come about in politics. They quite often get dissolved in politics too, but they also come apart. And I can, go through other examples too. So it's those sorts of things, at least kind of as a first slice at the problem, that I kind of look at.
Right. Yeah. And so it's kind of in a political setting, it's really not maybe friendship. It's not like a personal friendship. Perhaps it's more weighted on the respect side of thing, right? The respect and then the common, we want to make a difference for people in our community or our province or our country. So we want to work together and we respect each other in doing that, right? Or
I think it is a little bit more. I mean, the respect certainly has to play a role, but I think in a lot of cases, the friendship can actually be beyond simply respect. I mean, respect is important, but I can respect my enemies. And my favorite example of that is during World War II, Winston Churchill, he rose in the House of Commons and gave a little speech in praise of the great German general Erwin Rommel. Now, can you imagine in the middle of a war against your enemy, you give a speech praising the top general? he kind of got a fire for that. So he had great respect for Rommel. I mean, this was after, just kind of a little backstory, Rommel was implicated in a plot to assassinate Hitler. So Hitler told him he had to commit suicide. And that's what Rommel did. And so Churchill praised him not only as a great general, but as an honorable man. But you can respect your enemy, but you wouldn't love your enemy. I mean, that raises all sorts of other questions, of course.
True.
So I think politics, especially the working together and building coalitions and building networks needs something more than simply a kind of utilitarian calculus, more than simply we work together. And you notice that something more in the examples of Winston Churchill, for example, or of a Ronald Reagan, or Margaret Thatcher. Closer to home, back in the 90s when Ralph Klein was premier, he was actually friends with Pam Barrett, who at the time was the NDP leader, and they would regularly go for lunch in the cafeteria of the Alberta legislature. So they'd spend the morning, tearing each other apart in the ledge, and then they go for lunch. Because Winston Churchill would tear people apart and be torn apart in the House of Commons, and then they'd go have a whiskey.
Yeah, that a little odd, eh? I don't think that happened very often then, and not now.
Can you imagine? Right? Can you imagine Premier Kenney and Rachel Notley going for lunch or sharing a whiskey? No. And so, I mean, that raises questions about, we worry today about the fraying of hyper-partisanship and the fraying of political and social bonds and lower trust in politics and so forth. So part of my interest in friendship and politics is a kind of response to a kind of perceived crisis that we might have.
Sorry about that. My wife came in and we threw her off a little so that we started a half hour early.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
Do you need me for right now?
No, I was going to tell you supper when you're done the show.
All right. Thank you. You're a good woman. All right. No problem. Okay. Yes. So it's more, I was understating what it is in terms of friendships in that setting. And I don't think it's just public service, it's also a community service type thing. I think there's a lot of, like, you like and trust people who have similar, want to make the same kind of differences you want to make, kind of a thing too, right? I think that's kind of a natural affinity, right? So
if you want to be a successful politician, I think it really helps to like people. Simple. I mean, that's a good starting point. I mean, a lot of the most successful politicians are very good at, they're very good at networking, but it's not simply networking. They're very good at kind of making people feel special. And that takes a lot of energy. They remember people, they remember names. And, I remember Peter Lougheed, former Premier of Alberta, just had a photographic memory for people's names. And I only met him, I think, once or twice, I was a kid back in the day. And I don't know if he remembered my name, but he certainly made like he remembered. And he had a reputation for knowing people and kind of, it's all up in the head. Bill Clinton, very similar. People quite often marveled at his almost supernatural ability to remember people's names, remember a certain detail about people. Jean Chrétien was the same way. And it's just a talent. I don't have that talent. I can barely remember people's names a minute after I meet them, never mind several years. So it really is a special talent. And it's not, those sorts of things aren't quite the same as kind of cultivating serious friendships with people, but they're kind of in the same ballpark.
Right. Exactly. And I guess that's when I think you started with a comment about like real politicians or full politicians and
serious.
And probably the percentage of the ones that are just like really very engaged with it, very like putting in the effort and really just wanting to make a difference over their own personal benefit kind of a thing. Mm-hmm. Do you think they'd be in the minority, or is that common in politics and we just view it negatively?
It's hard to say. It's very easy to be cynical about politicians. We citizens, and I think we scholars of politics are also kind of guilty of this. We tend to be a little bit self-congratulatory. We're morally good. Those politicians are all corrupt. And it's a kind of myth we like to tell ourselves. I think most of the people who are in politics are there for decent reasons. If you want to become a member of parliament, my goodness, the amount of time you have to stay away from home and the lonely hours. And it's a tough slog. all the hours you have to spend in airports, especially if you come from Western Canada and it's we're hours away by plane from Ottawa. It's a terrific sacrifice. So I tend to be a little bit more charitable in my interpretations, that I think most of them are decent people who are in it for the sake of doing some sort of public service. I think if you ask most of them why they initially went into politics, quite often is because something they didn't like, something that they wanted, something they believed in that needed to be solved, and they felt like they really needed to contribute. That's not everybody, but I think it's more than we think.
Yeah, I suspect you're right. I think even if you think of local politics and our mayor and council kind of a thing, and how much prep work they have to do for a meeting in a municipality of our size, it's huge if you do that job right? In terms of the prep work you have to do and the research you have to do in order to make informed, good decisions. It's not an easy task by any means. So.
No, and kind of the junk you have to put up with too. Right. There's a lot of nastiness that's out there, and all the stuff that's online. Or you talk to any of or any representative, member of parliament or legislative assembly, and the amount of abusive phone calls and emails that they get. I mean, they have staff to kind of insulate them from a lot of it, but it's pretty tough. You need a pretty, I mean, this is kind of the paradox. You need quite a thick skin to be a politician, but at the same time, you also have to kind of have a bit of a thin skin insofar as you have to be able to sympathize, you have to be able to hear people and listen to people and kind of make them feel like they're included and have a stake. And so it's hard to do both, right? If you have too much thick skin, then you're not going to listen to anybody. But if you have too much thin skin, then you're going to be hurt.
Yeah, and the same kind of thing holds true as well about there are going to be tough decisions, and there's going to be some that don't like those decisions, no matter as well as you could explain them, right? But they don't want to know as well, right? They don't want to know the whole thing. They want to know, this is the result I wanted. It didn't happen. Now I'm mad, right? Or I'm upset with the political process, right? So
yeah, and unfortunately, the political process. I mean, in an ideal situation, if you make a decision that somebody is unhappy with, the best way to deal with it is try to explain it as best you can and make sure that the person who's unhappy sort of feels like they've been listened to. And, okay, I've been listened to, they respect my opinion, and even though I lost this round, I still have hope that the next round I can be on the winning side. I mean, that's kind of how politics, I think, sort of as a muddle is best practice, is that even though we may not win on issue number 1, well, we still have hope that we can win on number 2. That sort of stuff. But the problem is that I think in politics, for whatever reasons, the opportunities for leaders to kind of allow, say, losers to save face, let's call it that, they don't have that many opportunities to do that. It's like, okay, we won our side, or we won our court case, let's move on. Yeah. So, yeah.
So the concept of friendship and the concept of civility have a common tie, do they not?
Yeah, that's a question I've been thinking about of late. This reading group we've been reading this book, Mere Civility, by an Oxford professor, Teresa Bejan, and she's a big defender of civility. So this issue comes up quite often in debates over free speech. So, for example, the argument goes something like this. Proponents of free speech will quite often say, let's have free speech, but we got to be civil with one another. We got to be kind of polite with one another. And quite often, people who are passionate about their ideas will be a little bit affronted by that, because quite often the implication or the interpretation is, if I tell you, Alan, you need to be civil, right? I'm kind of implying that you're not civil. And as a result, it's kind of it's kind of a slag on you. It's kind of already I'm trying to kind of cheating in a sense. It's not really about free speech anymore. It's more about me good, you bad.
You're right.
So civility, at least one way of looking at it, is kind of, I think for good reasons, a little bit distrusted, because it's quite often used as a club. Well, quit screaming at me, you're being uncivil. We got to be civil, right? So civility looks a little bit dubious. There's the other side of civility, though, which is, you might say, the good side, which is, well, at a certain point, we have to be able to persuade one another. We have to be able to not necessarily persuade each other because I'm more angry or you're more angry. It's usually anger that civility is contrasted with, but rather we have to persuade one another just on the merits of the case. So civility is kind of one of these kind of political virtues when it's used properly, which allows persuasion to get kind of to be liberated from the sort of coercion, and also the sophistry, and also the kind of hyper emotions that can get involved in politics too. So civility kind of requires us to have a bit of a thick skin, to not take, say, even insults too seriously, but in the end, to instill in us a kind of respect as dialogue partners. Now, to get to the other part of your question, is it connected to friendship? I think friendship, we ask more of friendship. And it kind of gets back to this respect and liking bit. In terms of civility, I don't have to like you, right? Friendship seems to be more than that. Friendship seems to imply, even civic friendship, in the form of, say, being part of a common nation and so forth, seems to imply a greater sense of affection we might have for one another simply because we're fellow citizens of the same country. Civility, it seems to me, depending on how you look at it, civility might be something that you could even extend to your enemies, just as you could extend respect to your enemies, right? And the example I have there is back when Stephen Harper was prime minister, when he was at a G7 conference right after Russia invaded the Crimea. And Harper, this kind of was in the news, what Harper did when he met Vladimir Putin, and he said, well, I'll shake your hand, but let me tell you right now, get out of the Ukraine. And so by shaking his hand, he was being civil, right? But make no bones about it, he didn't think that Putin was his friend by any means, quite the opposite.
Right.
And so the way that Harper treats Putin in that situation, we might call civil, but we wouldn't really want Harper to treat his fellow Canadians in the same way. Right?
Right, right.
So civility seems to, at least in my own reading, it's a very helpful virtue, but at the same time, it kind of begs the question of, well, are we still, do we owe anything more to those who are, say, part of our same community versus those who are in other countries, or perhaps even rivals or even enemies, right? And I think we do owe more to those who are in our communities than, to the Vladimir Putins in the world. But how we kind of defend that and reflect on it is kind of a question.
Do you think that civility is kind of like sort of a prerequisite for productive dialogue, productive conversation, that you have to have civility to make that work?
It seems so, yeah. I mean, civility, the term civility, it has a very old history to it. It derives from the Latin word civitas, which means city. There's a Latin term too, civilitas, which means kind of the habits and the virtues of the citizen. So civility kind of literally means the habits and moral character of the citizen. And that kind of says, okay, well, what, if that's the case, then what kind of city does the citizen belong to, and all that. But to get directly to your question, I think civility is helpful because in order for us to have decent politics, we need to be able to persuade one another. In the best case scenario, we try to persuade one of various options, various choices, by means of rationality, by making the best case, and not by jettisoning persuasion, not by jettisoning reason, but by trying to find a place in our public debates for a kind of principled, reasonable debate, so that reasonable people can have a debate and can even disagree reasonably. And I mean, one of the things I've always been kind of fascinated with is parliamentary procedure. I'm no expert in it by any means, but I've done a bit of reading over the years, and you just pay attention to the rules of decorum that govern, say, the Legislative Assembly in Edmonton, or the House of Commons in Ottawa, or anywhere else. And these are rules of procedure whereby members of the House, members of the Legislative Assembly, have to follow certain rules of decorum, of debate, in order for the debate to proceed smoothly. It's like all of us, or most of us, have been in meetings, and meetings have a certain procedure, parliamentary procedure, and quite often, a lot of the rules that we have, like Robert's rules or Borno's rules, which are more Canadian, those are written by people who understand the workings of legislative assemblies. So, for example, if you're an MP, the Speaker of the House, you can't speak unless you are addressed by the Speaker of the House. You know, it's your turn, right? It's not a shouting match where whoever shouts the loudest wins the debate. No, it's a principled, kind of rule-based way of running a meeting. And moreover, when the Speaker of the House calls on you, the Speaker doesn't say, "I now call on Alan to speak," but rather the Speaker says, "I now call on the member from Lethbridge to speak," to remind you that you are serving the people of Lethbridge. You're not in it for your own glory and your own ambition. I mean, you're ambitious and all that. We know that. But by calling you the member of Lethbridge, or the member of Parliament for Papineau, which is where Justin Trudeau is representative, that's a kind of a way of reminding participants that they are servants of the Canadian people and also of the House of Commons. They're members. And so parliamentary procedure is this nice way of kind of both elevating but also channeling the kind of raw emotions and ambitions of political partisans in order that a more kind of, you might say a quieter, but not always quiet, where deliberation and the deliberative virtues can more easily be seen. I mean, it's hard to see on most days in the House of Commons, but it's still there. So I've always been fascinated just on how parliamentary procedure and kind of the logic behind it is used as a kind of the psychological underpinnings, you might say, of parliamentary procedure. Because that's really what civility is about. It's trying to tame our anger. Because anger is, you know, from time immemorial, is one of the primary political passions. You know, I don't like you because you're on the opposite side, you're a horrible person, you know, all this sort of stuff. And so politics, because it kind of involves anger plays a strong part. So we need forms and institutions to mitigate it, not to eliminate it. You can never eliminate it, but at least to channel and mitigate it. So civility is one of those virtues that, you know, we try to teach people and you know, try to teach our parliamentarians through rules of parliamentary procedure. So it's kind of
off topic, but stick with me for a moment here.
Yeah.
If, you know, given our global pandemic, and so every citizen in the world is affected by this somehow, some way, right? The approaches to dealing with this varied from across the world, right? So would this have been a good, if there was a one world government, here's the one world government, right? What would have been a better way to, I'm just throwing this out there, would that have produced better results? And is there any merit in the thought that, no, okay, carry on, why not?
No, well, okay, I'm shaking my head quickly. It's, you know, I'm not dismissing the question. It's a good question, because I think what you're putting your finger on is it more efficient to respond to emergencies, to respond to crises when you have a unitary type government? So in this case, a one world government. And there's a lot of weight to that sort of question. And even in the responses of many countries across the world, there's a kind of mini version of that claim, which is Parliament shouldn't meet at this time because we have an emergency. So we're going to invoke either emergency powers, or we're going to make use of all the powers available to the executive branch of government which doesn't have to respond right away to the House of Commons and just let the executive branch do its work, because it can make decisions very quickly. So it's this efficiency at decision making that I think it might be sort of behind your question about one world government, because after all, if you have one world government, then isn't that more efficient than having, I've lost count. I don't even know how many countries there are in the world, 180 or 190, right? Isn't that more efficient? So, I mean, you can look at that question both as a kind of sort of universal question of, the question of one world. You can also look at it as a question of what executive power in any kind of government, Canada, US, Chinese, whatever, can deliver. And the main thing there is the fewer people making the decisions and the greater sort of the greater scope that they have to make their decisions, then arguably, so the argument goes, you can solve problems more quickly, right? So in Canada, for example, the federal government, it's played an important role in terms of the big bank accounts in the Bank of Canada and the CERB and the EI and stuff like that. But when it comes to the actual fighting of the virus, it's the provinces, right? Because that's where the health is. And a similar argument I've seen be made in the United States. So I would actually argue that decentralization is actually on display right now, and maybe showing why local is the way to go in a lot of situations, especially a case like this. I mean, health is a provincial responsibility, and it's the health regions and the health agencies of the provinces seem to be very nimble, or they probably have greater ability to be nimble in responding to flare-ups, right? Because it's that, okay, we have to make sure people are on the ground, and we need to make sure that our decision makers are close enough to those people close on the ground to be able to respond to flare-ups. And that's going to be a very even more important when we have the second wave that people are talking about, right? So, and so in a sense, I think what we're seeing in the responses to the pandemic, it's something what some people call subsidiarity, right? Subsidiarity is a kind of a theory which says that the agency that is kind of best placed to respond to a problem is the one you should use. So if it's too far away, then it's not going to help you. If it's too close, if it's too small, it's not going to help you. So it kind of depends on the problem, kind of depends on the issue, right? And in this case, it's your health agencies and health ministries that are doing the heavy lifting.
Right. Yeah, definitely so. Definitely so. Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, I could. The only reason why I thought of it the other day was like, right now with all of the COVID problems in the animal processing type things. So what is happening? Cattle feeders can just kind of pull back on their ration a little. They can defer on when that cattle is ready to go to market, right? But hog producers don't have that option. Chicken producers don't have that option, and milk producers don't, right? So what's happening? They're dumping swimming pools of milk out, down the drain, right? And euthanizing cattle or pigs like crazy, and euthanizing chickens. So when there's people starving in other parts of the world, and you think, all right, well, here we're just like destroying all these animals for no value whatsoever, right? So it's, no, I mean that's tragic to see. I mean, I don't know how you could arrange especially at such short notice, how you could rearrange, say, supply chains so that you can get surplus pigs, and especially goods that are that can go bad, like milk, for example. Right. How you can get that to other parts of the world so quickly. I mean, that just strikes me as a insurmountable, or at least an extremely difficult thing to do, especially at short notice. Yes.
Those are tough issues. I was going to say something else. Oh yeah, in defense of the locality, or in defense of even federalism, I mean, each of the provinces, each of the countries even, has responded a little differently to the pandemic. And it's kind of, I mean, we political scientists quite often like to use the term the textbook of federalism, which is to say that, well, we can learn from others and see what works. If everybody has a different approach, then that's kind of like a laboratory, right? PEI does it a little differently. Quebec does it differently. BC does it differently, or even on a global level. I mean, right now, there's a lot of attention being given to Sweden,
Right.
because they didn't really have a lockdown. But now, you know, their death rates are actually quite a bit higher, at least higher than the surrounding Nordic countries. So countries like Denmark and Finland aren't so sure that they want to open their borders because they're worried about Swedes.
Well, I understood that Sweden, even though Sweden didn't put the sanctions in place, the Swedish citizens kind of made their own distancing type. You know, they basically followed what other countries, other citizens in other countries where they were required to. They just followed that from a good practice standpoint, right?
I think that's a really, really important point. I mean, right now we kind of think, well, when will the government reopen the economy and so forth? But I think what you just pointed out, it's not really the government that opens the economy. It's you and me. It's people, right? You know, my wife and I have to decide, okay, do we feel safe sending our kids back to school if the schools reopen? Or do we feel that our kids are safe if say they go to summer camp even? And on and on and on. All those micro decisions that are made in you know, people as individuals, people as families across the world. It's really, I mean, if I were an economist, that would be a really fascinating problem to study, right? How markets respond, and markets, not just people making sort of economic exchanges, but the whole networks of people making all these micro decisions that affect their lives. And you know, it's kind of a collective action problem, because you know, people kind of look to their governments to kind of say, okay, here's the all clear, but they don't quite trust their governments do that, because well, maybe the government wants us to be guinea pigs, right? So who's going to be first, right? It's like, you know, there's sort of a collective action problem with universities. We're sort of into it now, you know, the decision of how to open, if at all, in the fall, right? Who's going to be the first?
Yeah.
And it's almost like, well, which group starts first? You know, nobody really wants to stick their necks out, because, you know, we had an open house at our own university today, and our university president, Mike Mann, he said, you know, probably he told us the nightmare scenario for him as president is that we open in the fall and then have to close and send the students home, just like we had to do in March. That's the last thing we want, right? So how do we avoid that?
Yeah.
Right, and that's
on a very small type scale of that, I teach, one of the things I do on weekends is teach the Canadian Firearm Safety course. So I didn't teach it in April or May. I'm hoping to resume in June, but man, to just the logistics for that little one classroom, you know, we're scaling back the number of people and kind of walking through the logistics of how we're going to do this and make it, you know, an effective learning experience, but not get anybody sick in the process. And there's a lot of little bits you got to think through, right? So so when you take the University of London, when you've got 87, I don't know how many classrooms there's like hundreds of classrooms at the U of L campus, right?
And each building has its own different sort of ecosystem, and you know, suddenly we never think of really surfaces of things before, but now we do, right? It's like this doorknob. Did somebody touch that? You know? Stuff like that.
I'm probably less concerned than I should be, and my wife is way more concerned. So like to keep her satisfied, I'm doing a lot more than I would normally do on my own. It's just like, okay, I'm wearing a mask, I'm wearing the gloves, I'm using the alcohol, you know, because I don't want her freaking out that I'm going to infect her. So
mean, this is the bizarre thing about the virus is that it's so unpredictable, right? I mean, people say, oh, it's just a flu, or the flu kills more people. Well, that might be, but we also have the flu under better control in a way, because we have vaccines and stuff. I mean, it's not 100% by any means, but we're kind of used to the flu, whereas this is brand new. And from what I can tell, it's kind of a crapshoot. I mean, sure, if you're young, you tell yourself, oh, just takes out old people. So young people are under the illusion that it doesn't affect them, but I don't think that's quite true. And so just the randomness, and pandemics have a way of confounding people, because people like to believe that they have a kind of control over their environments. Right? I mean, I study politics, and politicians and people in societies like to feel comfortable. They like to have their security. And the pandemic, if it's done anything, has really undermined our sense of personal safety and security. And it just seems that, it's hard to find the right balance. Right?
Definitely. I watched a webinar a while back on John Spence is his name. He's a business advisor guy. And his advice for dealing with the pandemic is basically you make a list of the things that you can control, right? So, those are, and maybe control is too strong a word, maybe influence is a better word, but, I can make sure I get enough sleep. I can make sure I eat well. I can make sure I exercise. I can make sure that I take precautions when I go out. Those are the only things that are within my control. All the other, what happens when I step out into a store or try and serve a customer and keep myself safe, that's kind of a little bit beyond my control. If somebody comes up next to me and coughs on me, well, I couldn't control that. But so, yeah.
And you hope that people learn not to do that.
I have a friend who was telling me that in Japan, where they're so quick to put masks on, that's kind of a cultural thing to protect others, that they don't want to spread to others, which we certainly, we as North Americans, or we as Canadians, certainly haven't embraced that idea, it doesn't appear.
I think there's a bit of a push on. I see that today that the federal government is advising people to start wearing masks. But it's not so much to protect yourself as to try to protect others. And I mean, nobody really exactly knows how much, right? I see a lot of chatter online and so forth of people complaining that the experts originally told us not that masks don't do any good, and now they're telling us to wear them. Experts are useless. And we probably have too much of a love-hate relation with experts. We like to tell ourselves that science is our salvation. Science can kind of solve all of our problems. But then we actually don't like the fact that science is never really certain of anything. It makes conclusions, but the science is never settled.
Right.
That's just what science is about. And that part of science is really hard to square with the sort of the political demand to have, okay, we're going to do this, and I'm going to tell you with authority, right? So authority and science are actually, if you think about it, two very opposing things. And if you try to make science your authority, then it's, in the end, I think it's going to corrode the authority of science, and you kind of see that going on. So, I mean, I feel kind of sorry for these poor public health, authorities who are being called upon to kind of make these proclamations. Quite often, the politicians sort of push them in front. Here, you talk, you take responsibility for this, and if it doesn't work out, I'm going to throw you under the bus. Right, that's a very nice thing to do, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think here in Canada, and especially in Alberta or British Columbia, we're blessed with very competent chief health officers who are doing their best and kind of, giving advice that is based on the best available evidence. But I mean, that's the key: available evidence, right? We've only known about this. Well, okay, the Chinese hid it for a while, but really, we've only really known about this virus for 3.5 months, which is not long at all. And already, pharmaceutical companies are doing tests on vaccinations. That's remarkable. That's incredible.
Yeah, it really is. The time frame is huge, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't
So-
I find it hard to criticize anybody in these public health roles because they're dealing with something that's never ever happened before. It'd be amazing if they got everything perfect right from the get-go, right? There's been a lot of adjusting back and trying to figure out the balance, right? To take care of people but still have lives that are meaningful. So
Yeah, and especially since there seems to be something about this virus that it hides. It doesn't always appear. You can get false positives, false negatives. The effects. I've lost the word for it, but symptoms. That's the word I'm thinking of. The symptoms. It's not necessarily your lungs. It's a lot of different things. And when the symptoms start, it quite often looks like something else. I read a story about a kid in New York who he ended up, he got eventually diagnosed with the coronavirus, but it wasn't attacking his lungs, the stuff that you mostly read about. It was actually attacking his circulation system. So he described it as, it's as if his entire circulation system was on fire.
Ooh.
And he had a fever of like 104 degrees Fahrenheit, a resting heart rate of well over 160 beats per minute.
Oh.
Yeah, so it nearly killed him. And they finally figured out, like he initially had a negative COVID test, and then they tested him again, and sure enough, it was positive. But at the start, they thought, well, it might be the flu, maybe it's mono. And then, of course, it gets worse and worse, and then suddenly it gets precipitously worse. Right?
Yeah.
You've never seen it before. It's just symptoms that were outside what they thought this virus was about. But of course, the knowledge of their virus is only, as you say, 2 months old.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So what I'm impressed with was how well they've been actually able to deal with it and also to heal people.
Right. Yeah. Hey, back to, if you think about it, if, the Black Plague and those times where people had no idea why people were dying, people were just dying, and it was just like, all right, you throw them on the bucket and take them over to the pole, right? So at least, there's certainly a lot of energy, resources, and smart people that are trying to solve problems, right? So that's good news. So, hey, you had mentioned before about this Nobel laureate winner. I don't know anything about him. Tell me.
So I've been reading a lot about this fellow for last while. I mean, so here's the background. Liu Xiaobo. He was Chinese. He's a Chinese dissident. He won the Nobel Prize in 2010. He couldn't attend the ceremony because he was locked up in a Chinese prison. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, he is the only, maybe there's another one, recipient of the Peace Prize whose government prevented them from receiving it.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
Even the Nazis eventually let their guy get his. So the Chinese Communist Party are a bunch of nasty folks. Anyway, Liu Xiaobo. So he dies in 2017 in prison. He develops liver cancer because when you're in a Chinese prison, you're prone to get hepatitis. And the government doesn't let him they give him treatment, but they never let him leave the prison hospital, and he died in the prison hospital. He asks to get treated by Western medicine, and they prevent him. So it's very vindictive. Let's circle back. Liu Xiaobo was a literature scholar and a fairly well-known one in the 1980s in China. In 1989, he's in New York on a sabbatical or something, on a guest. He's a guest scholar at New York University. And that's when the protests are going on in Tiananmen Square. You're old enough probably to remember the protests of Tiananmen Square. So do you remember that famous picture of the guy in front of the tanks?
Yep.
Tiananmen Square. Yeah, and you know how that ended up too, right? With Tiananmen Square. They sent in the tanks and they shot everybody, or shot many people. We've never really had a decent count of how many people that the People's Liberation Army killed. Liu Xiaobo was, so he was in New York when he flew back in middle of May of 1989 to join those protests. And he ended up being one of about half a dozen leaders. So there's mostly students who are protesting, but students need a bit of direction, they need a bit of guidance. And he was about a group of about half a dozen academics, intellectuals, who ended up protesting with the students. And for his efforts, after they dealt with the protests, he spent the next several years in prison, because that's what they do. And he actually spent a couple more terms in prison. In 2008, he was the main organizer of one of the probably the most important documents in China of Chinese supporters of democracy. It's called the Charter 08, which was a statement saying, we should China needs to work towards democracy. For his efforts, the Chinese sentenced him to an 11-year prison sentence, and that's where he died in prison. So he ended up writing a lot. So he was a scholar of literature. After 1989, that changed his life, and he really dedicated himself to the life of being a dissident. And he did so as a way. He saw his work of being a dissident as an act of atonement. He used that language, an act of atonement for the young kids who were killed at Tiananmen Square.
Okay.
In part because he was one of their leaders, he felt partially responsible for what happened. Of course, ultimately, it was the Chinese Communist Party that's responsible. But he felt that he let them down. And he also felt that they made a sacrifice for the cause of democracy, that he was too much of a weakling to do. And so he always dedicated his dissident work to the dead and also to the mothers of the dead. There's a group of mothers of those who were killed, called them the Mothers of Tiananmen. And they would lobby the Chinese government, with not much success, to, for a reconciliation of somehow, to a reckoning, an account of what the government had done that day. And so he dedicated his life after that to the dissident work and the promotion of democracy. And so it's that dissident work that got him the Nobel Prize in 2010, and of course cost him his life. Now, that's great, very heroic. The thing that I find particularly interesting about him, and it comes from his his own philosophy, his own political philosophy, and it's one, you can read his defense speech actually at his final trial. It's really quite moving. But in his defense speech, he says that I have no enemies. I have no enemies, and I have no hatred. I don't regard the Chinese government as my enemy, and I can't hate them, because hate is something that corrodes yourself, poisons the well-being, and destroys you. And so, both as a principled measure, but also as a pragmatic thing, he adopted a kind of "I have no enemies, I have no hatred" philosophy as the governing philosophy of his dissident work. And by doing so, he was inspired by a wide variety of political figures, religious figures, philosophical figures. So his heroes included Nelson Mandela, who adopted something similar as the key of reconciliation after apartheid. Right? He made peace with the Afrikaners, and he had to. Right? Gandhi was another one of his heroes. Martin Luther King Jr., Jesus, Jesus of Nazareth was one of his heroes. And St. Augustine, the Christian bishop and saint, was one of his heroes. And that's kind of how I kind of got to Liu Xiaobo, because when he was in prison immediately after Tiananmen Square, so this would have been in the 90s, he was at a Chinese labor camp in northeast China. His wife would make a trip to visit him on a monthly basis, and she'd quite often bring him books. And because he's an academic, he's an intellectual, he read these books voraciously, and a lot of them really kind of changed him in fundamental ways. And one of these books was the Confessions of St. Augustine. And to back up, Augustine was the topic of my first book, kind of looking at his kind of overall outlook to what politics is about and so forth. And, it's kind of a long route to I'm thinking about friendship now, partly because of my previous, what I learned from Augustine. But what I found really fascinating, I just have this image of my head of a Chinese dissident reading Augustine's Confessions in a prison camp in northeast China, just off the North Korean border. And it's an image that is really unusual and confounds the usual image that many of us in the West have of people who read a 4th century medieval theologian, right? Liu Xiaobo is not a monk. Liu Xiaobo is not a kind of Catholic intellectual. Liu Xiaobo is not this or that. He's completely outside the categories of the sorts of people we would expect to be reading somebody like Augustine. And what's fascinating too is that I mentioned earlier that Liu Xiaobo saw his dissident work as an act of atonement for the deaths of the young who died on June 4th, 1989. In order to properly atone, one first must confess. So his trajectory of his dissident work, Augustine was never much of a dissident for himself, but that doesn't matter. What he does is kind of give the intellectual and spiritual tools to a dissident for his work. And I find that fascinating. Fascinating. So the dissident work is not simply a political matter, it's also a spiritual mission. And it's especially when challenging the tyranny of a nasty regime like the Chinese Communist Party. I'm glad this is on Google, which is American owned. If this were on Zoom, it'd probably be shut off by now. So he sees it as a kind of a spiritual mission. And there's one other dimension with the confession that I want to just point out. After he gets arrested for his role in the protests at Tiananmen Square, he's forced to write out a confession to the Chinese police, the secret police, and basically which repudiates. It's one of these forced confessions, right? I repudiate what this is about. I shouldn't have done it. I'm sorry for being an enemy of the people. This sort of stuff. So total BS, right? And that was something that he could never live down afterwards. So in making a false confession, he had betrayed the young who died.
Right, okay.
Right? It's sort of like the guilt that people have when, if they do something way and afterwards they're racked with guilt, with survivor's guilt or something like that, that others died, but I lived because I'm a coward, right? And it's something like that. And so he had to learn how to confess in a more authentic fashion than this forced confession, this forced political confession. And he kind of saw his post-1989 writings and dissident work as this act of confession. And just kind of a last point, his wife is delivering these books for him to read once a month while he's in prison in the 1990s. And I think I mentioned one of them is Augustine's Confessions. Well, he's not just reading, he's also writing himself. And he writes essays, he writes poems. And there's a precious little poem that he has written on St. Augustine.
Yeah, neat.
So, again, it just kind of confounds you, right? Here he is in this, dirty, gross prison, political prisoner, writing poems of what? Well, lots of different topics, but one of them is on Augustine.
Wow.
And he dedicates it to his wife. And that's maybe a final point I'll make, is that he viewed himself not just him, but as one half of a team. And his love and indeed kind of deep marital friendship with his wife, Liu Jia, was really important. And she knew when they got married that she was in for a rough rest of her life with this guy, because they got married after Tiananmen. He'd already been sentenced and all that. In fact, they had to get married so that she could actually come visit him. And at that time, they were nice enough to let them get married. But so his writings are in some ways not just him as a solitary writer, but kind of in communion with his wife. And so you have this kind of spiritual communion of two people together who are behind this text.
Cool.
And this work.
Yeah, that's a great story. Wow.
Yeah. So, it's one of the things I've actually been working on for lately, because I want to write on it.
Cool.
Yeah.
Hey, John, we're in hour 6, so I guess we've kind of burned up our time again. I was going to sing a song.
Okay.
You're saying Lyle Lovett. I don't know the Lyle Lovett one offhand. I know a couple that I really like, but I can't think of them right now. But this one,
had a boat,
pardon
I'd
me?
go out in the ocean. If I had a pony, I'd go out on my boat. If I forgot the next line.
Keep it going. You had it.
I forgot it. I got to look up the lyrics.
Well, the part I was going to do was that we had mentioned Churchill briefly. So here, how many songs do you know that reference Churchill? Not many, I don't think.
Not many, no.
Here's one.
Okay.
In May of 1941, the war had just begun. The Germans had the biggest ships that had the biggest guns. The Bismarck was the fastest ship that ever sailed the sea. On her decks were guns as big as stairs, with shells as big as trees. Out of the cold and foggy night came the British ship, the Hood. And every British seaman, they knew and understood. We gotta sink the Bismarck, the terror of the sea. Stop those guns as big as steers and them shells as big as trees. The Hood found the Bismarck, and on that fatal day, the Bismarck started firing 15 miles away. We gotta sink the Bismarck was the battle sound. But when the smoke had cleared away, the mighty Hood went down. For 6 long days and weary nights, they tried to find her trail. Churchill told the people, put every ship a sail. For somewhere on that ocean, I know she's gotta be. We gotta sink the Bismarck to the bottom of the sea. We'll find that German battleship that's making such a fuss. We gotta find the Bismarck, cause the world depends on us. We'll hit the decks of running balls and spin them guns around. And when we find that Bismarck, we're gonna cut her down.
Brilliant! Bravo! 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 That's awesome!
Anyways, thanks so much for coming on the show, John. That was I really enjoyed that, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Great to see you. All right. Bye-bye.